Okay. So the topic for today really could be phrased how to empower developers so that they own observability and whether that's a good idea or not. And I will argue it is a good idea, but I'm going to address some of the pushback on that as well. And what we're really going to be addressing here is like how you can take this thinking behind platform engineering in general about developer empowerment and enablement and how you can apply that, not just how we build a platform to get software into production, but what we also do when that software is in production and how we can empower developers across the whole lifecycle of developing software. Okay, so just a little bit about me. So I'm the co-founder of Robusta Dev, and we maintain a bunch of open source projects that really help empower developers around Kubernetes observability and troubleshooting their own alerts and doing that instead of going off and saying to a DevOps engineer or an SRE, hey, can you go and investigate this for me? So a lot of what we do is around that enablement and that empowerment. Today, I'm not going to speak about Robusta at all. If people are curious, you're always free to reach out to me. And I'm usually around KubeCons. Usually I'm the person with a big giant helm. And I think this last time we had t-shirts that said Chief EML Officer. So looking out for that sort of thing is usually a good way to find us. And we're always happy to discuss this type of topic. We work with really hundreds of companies that use our open source or commercial platform. So we see a lot of people dealing with this sort of problem around developer enablement and observability throughout the industry. I'm not going to speak really about a lot of those companies. I'm going to speak about publicly available examples that kind of reflect the trends that we're seeing and how people are approaching this across the industry. So everything I'm going to speak about it has like publicly referenceable examples online where companies have written about what they're doing. None of those are customers, but they reflect the trends that we see broadly among our customer base as well. Final comment before we jump right into it. Please ask questions as we go. Don't save all your questions for the end. I'll try and address stuff. For me as a speaker, it's a good way to know that you're with me and someone's listening and interested. So I always like to get questions as we go. So please feel free to pop questions into the chat or into the QA. All right, so let's get started. So the first question I want to address is like, well, isn't observability like kind of easy, right? Why do developers really need empowerment? Can't you just take Datadog or Dynatrace or your Prometheus and your Grafana? Can't you just take your observability dashboards? You're running on Kubernetes, let's say, and you have these dashboards set up and you have all these tools. Can't you just take those and give them to developers and say like, okay, like here are the tools you need. Go ahead, there's an error in production, there's another, go and investigate. Why do you need this empowerment? And the answer is, well, we kind of tend to forget just how complex a lot of these things are. So I want to put you in the shoes of like a typical customer of ours, let's say an enterprise company. You're an enterprise company, and you probably have thousands of developers, and you're an infrastructure engineer, you're on the platform team at one of these companies. And you're now doing this big migration to the cloud and to Kubernetes, and you're taking a lot of legacy applications, maybe a lot of legacy Java applications, and you're moving those onto the cloud and onto Kubernetes, and you have an entire fleet of developers, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of developers, who are really good at writing business logic and Java applications, and really understand their stuff, but they're not familiar with this entire world of cloud native and observability. And then you go to them and you say, okay, well, like here's the dashboard in Datadog or Grafana or whatever. I go and use this, and very often that fails. And just to illustrate that, I want to show you like a glossary that we put together of a lot of the different terms that just to begin to investigate something like, or to create your own dashboard in Grafana and to begin to take ownership of observability as a developer, you would have to really understand all these terms. And I put here on the left all the terms around kind of Kubernetes that you encounter when you're troubleshooting something in production. And then I put on the right, like all the terms, if you're going to go and define your own alerts in Prometheus, I'm just using Prometheus as an example. This applies to Datadog and Dynatrace and all other tools as well. But if like you're using Prometheus and Grafana and you want developers to take ownership of the alerting and the monitoring and the dashboards, like these are all the things that they would have to really know to just start getting up and running. So there's a lot of cognitive overhead here. And we tend to forget that as DevOps engineers and infrastructure engineers, as observability teams and platform teams, right? There's like a lot of stuff that we want these developers to go and to understand. And then what happens is we kind of say, okay, well, developers will take ownership, or developers can own this for their applications. We'll give them the Prometheus, we'll let them define the others, or we'll give them a Grafana instance. And what happens is they just don't do it. And they get another in Slack, and either they ignore it or they go and they open up a Jira ticket for someone else to investigate. And you start with this motion where you're trying to transfer ownership to developers, and you end up where you're doing everything. And like that motion to get developers to do it very rapidly becomes an empty motion in many companies. So what I'm going to talk about today is how you can fix that. I'm going to look at really practical tips. And I'm going to look at a few different examples of what companies have built internally to address this and what you can do about it as well. And if there are any questions so far, just kind of around like the topic or like why this matters or what you've seen, now would be, again, a good time to just pop that into the chat. And I'll address stuff as it comes in. So in general, we kind of see three approaches to ops and to who owns observability in general. And one, I call it the IT approach. So that's how Werner Vogel famously said, like, throw it over the wall, right? So someone develops an application and they take that application and then they hand it off to someone else to go and operate that. And when it comes to observability and operations, that's the same, right? So someone else has in the organization, not the developer, will have the responsibility for monitoring these applications and for looking at the dashboards and for receiving the alerts. You basically say, okay, well, someone else will do it for you. And I put the picture of a newborn here because it's kind of like the newborn approach. You're essentially saying, okay, we're the SRE team, or we're the operations team, and you know what, we're going to do it for you. Like, we're not going to do this empowerment. We don't think this is something that a developer should have ownership of. And this has some benefits. The main benefit of doing it this way is that, yeah, operations and monitoring and observability and all these things, it's a real discipline. So when you do it this way, then you have people who really are experts in that discipline who go and do it. And this is what kind of combined, but Google has like dedicated SRE teams and they handle the operations, they handle the monitoring and the observability very often. And they do something that's a little more like this, but that's a really expensive approach. They have one SRE for every 10 developers. So this isn't a great approach for most companies. It's just really expensive to do. And then we have what I call the sink or swim approach, and I put here a desert island. And that's where we say to a bunch of developers, like, okay, you build it, you run it, or you build it, you ruin it. And you're going to take it and you're going to do everything. And you say, okay, yeah, you know what? We give you a Prometheus instance. Take that Prometheus instance, take that Grafana, take this Datadog, set up your own stuff. It's your ownership. And that's the approach that many companies try and do. And it just ends up failing because of all that cognitive overhead and all the stuff that those developers have to know. This approach ends up not working. And again, it can work in some companies. It can work in like, especially a lot of younger companies where all the developers are like experts in Kubernetes. And if you're in that type of company where every developer like really understands the Kubernetes internals and they understand what like an HPA is and how to configure it, and they understand ephemeral containers and they understand how to troubleshoot their stuff in production. When you're in an environment that has like a really high level of Kubernetes sophistication among all your developers, this approach can work and it can be a really good approach. It doesn't work so well in the enterprise, and it doesn't work like in the reality of legacy applications and apps that were written before cloud native that are then shifted to the cloud. And you have all these developers who don't have always the expertise and skill in that. This approach fails and starts to break down there. And then the third approach here, I call the relationship model. And that's really about shared responsibility and assisted ownership. And that's why I call the platform engineering approach. Really here is about enablement and empowerment and shared responsibility, saying, okay, these are the areas that you'll own and these are the areas that we'll own. But on the areas that you'll own, we're still going to do some effort to enable you and to make it easy for you to succeed. And we're not going to just say you're all on your own. Okay. And I want to now go and I want to like make this a little bit more practical. And I want to show examples of what other companies are doing out there and show a few examples of what they've built and like how they're actually approaching this, and then give 4 principles that you can take back home to your teams and to your company and to apply to really do this enablement motion for observability. But before I go on, I want to just pause for a moment and give people a chance to pop in any questions or comments so far. Okay, I got an ack here that so far we're good. So I'm going to go on, but again, please feel free. So I want to speak about what I call the 4 pillars of observability enablement. Fantastic. I see there's a question here around automation. So yeah, we're gonna get to that. That's a big topic. So I want to jump into the 4 pillars of observability enablement, and why these are the kind of things you have to do, in my opinion, if you want to be successful in empowering developers. And the first I call AppCentric, and I put here a picture of the sun because it's like the Copernicus revolution, right? That the world doesn't revolve around Earth. Earth actually revolves around the sun. And when we build out, like if you think about how like you build a typical observability platform, it doesn't revolve around developers. It revolves around how we think of the world as like DevOps or SREs or operations, right? And I'll give a really good example of that. Let's say you're a Java developer and you're running a Java application on Kubernetes that's like auto-scaled with the HPA, the horizontal pod autoscaler. And it's running on a node somewhere. And it's sending stuff to Kafka, right? And then there's an alert that comes in and like, or there's some issue that happens, it has to scale up. There's like lots of stuff comes into the Kafka queue and the application scales up. So now there are more pods. And then there's an alert that fires. So like when you look at how this is spread out in Grafana or in Datadog for that matter, right, or in live places, then this is spread out over many, many different locations. There's one dashboard like on Java metrics. There's a completely separate dashboard for like auto scaling, right, or in the HPA. There's a completely separate dashboard that gives you like a list of pods, right, in the Kubernetes infrastructure view. There's a completely separate dashboard that will give you stuff on Kafka. And like the dashboards are built based on concerns and based on different like subsystems where you're collecting the metrics from. But when you're an application developer, well, you don't care about any of that, right? Like now you don't know where to go and look when there's an issue because the data is like spread out over all those different places. And I want to address also the question that David Robinson built in around automation. This is traditionally a little bit of a hard problem to solve because like if you think about, let's say you want to give every application, say you say, okay, I'm going to be app-centric. So I'm going to give every single application its own like single dashboard, a single dashboard for an application. But I have thousands of applications and each one needs different things in that like dashboard. So now you need some automation piece to like go and auto-generate Grafana dashboards where each dashboard like pulls in different things depending on the application so the developer can get a single pane of glass. And giving the developer that single pane of glass with like that one view, that's really hard to create with traditional tooling. And we'll loop back more to automation at the end as well. So to summarize this app-centric view, the app-centric part is giving you as a developer a point of view of the world where you can go into one page and you can see there everything that relates to your app and that you care about. And that will pull in things from different concerns. So that will pull in pods where the app is running. That will pull in maybe a history of changes that you made to the application. That will pull in like CPU and memory and other relevant metrics. That will pull in information auto-scaled if it's auto-scaled. But you have to have one single jumping point for that application that's app-centric. And we have to shift to an app-centric point of the world where we're thinking about my application and we're not thinking about like Java versus HPA versus Kubernetes, like, and all this data spread out. Okay, so that's the first pillar of observability, switching to an app-centric point of view. The second pillar of observability is what I call defaults by default. And what I mean by this is you have to let people like get started while they're running. And you have to let people get started with everything set up so that you just say like, okay, I'm going to empower you and I'm going to enable you and you're going to be able to do observability and you will have ownership of this. Well, from day one, they shouldn't have to do any work. From day one, they should be good to go. And like an example I like to give here is, let's say you, as a metaphor, to try and create some empathy here, let's say you work in a factory and you create like these little bolts or screws that you screw in. And then someone takes those bolts and screws and they put them inside an airplane. And now one day they bring you to the cockpit and they say, okay, you build it, you run it, now you're going to fly the airplane. Like that's a big jump, right? There's like all these other components here. So that's why it's like sometimes when you're a developer and like you're running, you built an application, now someone takes the application, you take the application, it's running on Kubernetes, and you've Dockerized it, it's like installed with Helm, and you have GitOps, you have all these other components, and you didn't build any of those components. You don't always know how to drive them. And now you have to be familiar with Kubernetes because Kubernetes is driving your application and it's scaling up and scaling down. You got all these Kubernetes events and all this stuff. And like that can be really overwhelming. And then to go and say to someone, okay, well, now go and build a dashboard for your application, like you're completely lost. Whereas if you're going to go and you're going to at least get someone to do a little bit of like driving that airplane, right? Then you should at least put them in the cockpit and say like, okay, the airplane is here in motion. Everything is fine. Like, just here's the steering wheel. You can hold it a little bit, or like, I'll help you. And you can go like push on this one button. That's relevant. But like everything is set up. You're in motion. Everything is fine. And to give people kind of more guided and gentler experience to get into things and to slowly gain more of that complexity, to slowly learn the ropes. And translating this to practical terms, like give people good dashboards by default, right? That with the stuff that they understand with an app-centric point of the world. And we will go even another level and like see screenshots and see examples of all this. Okay, finally, multi-environmental wear. What I mean by this is when you look at a modern application, you have the same application that's running in at least dev, test, and prod. And very often for many enterprise companies and for many of our customers at least, you have an application that is running in like 10 to 100 different like cloud environments or regions, right? So you have, at the very least, for many enterprises, like a few different instances in the EU, right? And then in the US, and then maybe in Asia. And then within each like cloud region, often you have different instances of the app for resilience. So you have a developer with one application from his perspective, but like from an infrastructure perspective, you actually have 16 applications. And traditional like monitoring and observability, which doesn't empower developers, takes kind of like an infra view of the world. So it doesn't correlate all that together. So like from you're looking at a dashboard in your favorite observability tool, it doesn't correlate that this is like the same deployment running in 16 different environments. Rather, you have 16 different applications that seem like 16 totally different things. And that just is a complete mess when you want to empower developers, because from their perspective, I'm running one application and I want to see all the instances of that application. And we'll see what a good solution for that looks like. And finally, the last pillar of observability enablement, I call it gives control. And there's two meanings to this. The first is we're not just giving you the observability tools and saying, here's like a dashboard and here's the data and here's everything that you need to look at in order to understand what's going wrong with your application. We also have to empower you to fix it, or whatever we done, right? What's the point? And second, we're giving you like an app-centric view of the world. We're giving you good defaults. Like we're trying to make something that's multi-environmental aware. But we also want to give you some level of customizability because your application is unique. And we can't just give you a platform, a cookie cutter platform that has no customization possible. And where you like can't do anything, can't customize anything, because that's really limiting and that won't solve the real needs that you have. So I want to go back now and just address the two questions that have come in so far. So the first one around automation, I addressed a little bit about that. The challenge is really of how you build this type of solution. And we're going to go a little bit more into the solutions that people are using out in the industry. And I'll give a few different examples there. And then when it comes to gives control, this is an area where automation has to play a big role. And the core friction here is, on the one hand, we want to give developers control. We want that developers not just observe problems, but also have the power to fix them. On the other hand, there are security problems with that. And we can't always just give developers raw access to production to go and like investigate or to fix stuff or to troubleshoot or to remediate problems. So there's a core friction that lies there. And therefore, like kind of the solution I would suggest, and the solution that we often see companies using, is to have like safe access to production, or some like automation that's been pre-approved where you have access to production, but only to do operations that were deemed safe in advance. So that's an area where we also see that automation. And then I see also there's another question here around security assurance as another function that the pool team is needed, but who should set up the architecture? So today I'm just going to speak on the observability side. And I'm not going to speak about how we get stuff into production. Touch on it maybe very, very briefly at that, but I'm not going to speak on how we get stuff into production. But in terms of who sets up the architecture and who sets up live architecture for observability, I would argue that the platform team or the SRE team or the observability team or whoever owns it in your company, they have to be the ones who kind of set stuff up. And then they provide ways like hooks for other teams to go and customize and to go and build on top of, but in a secure manner. I'm not sure if that was the original intent, but I hope I answered the question on that. And I'll pause for a moment in case there are more questions, and so I can take a sip of water. Okay, so what, okay, yeah, so there's a question here. Can I please go in again on the app-centric approach? So I'm going to do that. I'm going to actually jump over to the next slide, and I want to speak about it in the context. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through every single one of these. I'm going to show you screenshots and examples of what that looks like at a different company or with a different tool. So the first one we're going to look at is app-centric. And this is an example from Spotify Backstage that I would call an app-centric view of the world. And what I mean by that is here, the way that Spotify wrote about this is Kubernetes monitoring that's designed around the needs of service owners, not cluster administrators. And the high-level object here, like the first thing that you're looking at is you're looking here at like the dice roller. And the dice roller is like the unit here that you're looking at. And then you're looking at everything that's contained inside that dice roller. And there are 5 different examples of how you can build stuff like this. But an app-centric approach is an approach where like the first class citizen of your observability platform is the application. It's not like the node that it's running on. It's not the dashboard. It has to be the application. And I want to just contrast this view. When you have like an app-centric view of the world, that means you have a single page where you can see an application and everything that relates to that application. When you don't have an app-centric view of the world, that means that you have multiple dashboards that a developer will have to jump through and know to go to each one depending on all these different factors that are at a lower abstraction layer than he cares about. And I'll give a few examples again of this. Like if you have a Java developer running a Java application on Kubernetes that's auto-scaled with the horizontal pod autoscaler, he should not have to look at a separate dashboard and find like a separate thing for Java JVM metrics and garbage collection stuff, and a separate dashboard to see a list of pods, and a separate dashboard to see like how the application is being horizontally scaled. In traditional observability, those are all 3 different things. There's like a dashboard on Java, there's a dashboard on pods, and there's a dashboard on the HPA. But from an application developer perspective, I have my application. The application has these different facets and these different aspects, but I care about the application. It turns out like the sun does not revolve around the earth. Like the center of the world is not the HPA and it's not Java. The center of the world is the application developer and the application that he is running. Daphne, I hope that helped answer that question, but if not, please write a clarification. And I'll go on, I'll explain in more detail. Fantastic. Okay, so I want to look at each of these pillars. So I'm going to go again through each of these pillars. So we saw what app-centric means. And I want to look at now what I mean by defaults included. And I want to show here an example of Lens. And Lens is really, really popular among developers. And Lens does some things right and it does some things wrong. But I'll speak first about what Lens does right. What Lens does right is that any application developer can go in here and he can look at his deployment that's running on Kubernetes or his pods, and you can immediately see here CPU and memory and information about the network and the file system, right? And you can see all that information here. And he doesn't have to do anything. He doesn't have to configure a single dashboard. And this is a good example, actually, of the previous principle as well, right? Here I'm going in and I'm looking at an application, but I see other things in pods, but I see other things that relate to that. It's not a perfect example of that, but like it's a good starting point for giving something that's kind of an application-centric point of view. And that's why Lens is so popular among developers, because from a developer perspective, like you don't need to do anything. Like there's no setup. I have an application that's running on Kubernetes, and assuming I have access, then I just open up Lens, like double click on the executable, and I click on my application, and right there, I went in with an application-centric view of the world, right? Like went to my application or my deployment, and right there, I see everything that relates to my application. I can see that I have the top 9 metrics that I care about for my application without doing a single thing. And that's really powerful, right? That's really powerful because you don't have to do anything. Like all I have to do is I have to go and look. I don't have to set anything up. I don't have to learn anything. And the way this works is it catches me in the moment. Like I don't go and troubleshoot because I wake up in the morning and I say, today I'm going to go and troubleshoot, or today I'm going to investigate in the dirt. I go and I investigate in the dirt because something happened and I'm a really busy person. I have a million things going on, and suddenly an alert comes in, or there's something that like reaches me and I have to go and troubleshoot. And I just jump into Lens. I did no setup. I like did nothing. And now I just look at my application. I can troubleshoot right away. But if there's an issue in production and I have to go and I have to like look at that bunch of different dashboards, and it's not application centric, and there aren't great default setups, so I don't have like an easy place I can go in 60 seconds to look at it. Well, you know what I'm going to do as a developer? I'm going to open a Jira ticket. I'm going to ask, or I'm going to send a Slack message or a Teams message, right? It's the enterprise, so of course it's Teams, not Slack. But I'm going to send a message to someone, and I'm going to say, okay, we have an issue in production. Can someone else go and look at it, even if it's a really simple issue that I would have been able to solve if I looked at the pod logs. But if I don't have an easy way to get there, to get to the pod logs really quickly by looking at my application, really quickly finding the right logs, I'm not going to do it. That's the reality of life. Like the reality of life is that everyone is really busy. I don't want to say lazy. It's not that. It's everyone is really busy and everyone is overwhelmed all the time. And no one wants to go and learn something totally new. And no one wants to do something that feels complicated. So people will always take the easiest path. So you have to make sure when you do developer enablement, you have to make sure that your path, that the path you want people to take, is the easiest path. Water flows downhill. It's a fact of nature and you can't change it. And likewise, people will always take the easiest path. And it's just the law of nature. You can't change it. So what you have to do is you have to make sure that flowing downhill means that developers will go and troubleshoot stuff themselves because it's just so easy. Sorry about that. Now, I see that there's a comment here that all you have to do is use Kubernetes to benefit from tools like Lens. And this is, of course, true. But everything I say today, and I am giving all examples on Kubernetes because I work at a company that only develops for Kubernetes, and all of our customers use Kubernetes. So it's my comfort zone. But everything I say here today is principles. So that application-centric view of the world, that default by defaults, and the other 2 principles we'll look at, I want you to be able to take those home and think how you apply them, even if you're running on Nomad or doing something else. And I see that there's a question about when will this recording be posted. I think it's better for me to that the platform engineering community and someone from Humanitech maybe answer that.
Yes, so you will be getting the recording directly, probably tomorrow. And we also do have it streaming on YouTube, so you can always access it directly as well there.
Okay, and I'll add to this that I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, so if anyone wants to reach out afterwards and ask me questions personally, please feel free to do so. And I see there's another question. Will presenting related panes in a single dashboard qualify as app-centric, or do you mean that the metrics should be consolidated into one? Yeah, I mean presenting related panes in a single dashboard. That's let me answer that button. So yeah, presenting related panes in a single dashboard would qualify from my perspective as app-centric. And the point here is that a developer has one place that he has to go, and he doesn't have to like dig across a whole bunch of different systems where often he isn't familiar with where to go and where to look. And I think that part of the challenge here is like, well, how do you go and how do you do this, right? Because like that's not the way like that Grafana is exactly built, right? Like you need almost, if you have N applications and you need N Grafana dashboards, right? And like the same applies for Datadog dashboards and whatever. So that's one of the challenges. And why actually I have the tools that I'm showing today are now the observability tools. Like I'm showing here a service catalog, right? Or I'm showing like This is why it ties into internal developer platforms, because traditional observability tools weren't built for this. One of the things that we're working on, and one of our like learnings from speaking to all these different companies, is actually what people really want is they want the ability to take an application and then to almost like dynamically attach graphs to that application and to automatically generate dashboards. So what I mean by this is there's a cardinality issue. Let's say you have 1,000 applications. Each application has its own thing, and that's not maintainable. You can't maintain 1,000 dashboards. And you can try and get the teams to do it, but again, it often breaks down. And then there's no standardization. So really what you want to do is you want to be able to like focus on the concerns. So you want to be able to look at different concerns, like this is a Java application, so these Java metrics are relevant, or this is an application that's auto-scaled, so these auto-scaling metrics are relevant. You want to be able to look at that as input, but then as output to give the app-centric view of the world. So what you kind of want to be able to do is you want to be able to say like, okay, every Java application should see on its like app-centric dashboard, it should see these 3 metrics for the JVM. Every application that's auto-scaled with HPA should see this metric, right, in this graph. You want to be able to say like every, if I have a service mesh set up, right, if I'm using Kong or I'm using like an API gateway or whatever, then I should automatically pull into the dashboard for this application what relates to that service mesh when relevant. So really what you want to do is you want to like define a bunch of graphs or queries, and you want to define rules that attach those graphs and queries to that single app dashboard. And there isn't great tooling out there that does that. We've been working on some stuff here, and I'm happy, of course, to discuss with anyone who's interested. But this is an area where it's really challenging. I think that's one of the reasons that we often see people trying to do stuff like this on top of tools like Backstage that are built with an app-centric view of the world, and they have the service catalog of all the app-centric stuff. Okay. So just to move on, I want to move on. So we said really 4 pillars. First, app-centric. Second, default by defaults. Third, multi-environmental wear. And I want to show you here what I mean by multi-environmental wear. I'm taking here a dev portal that was built internally by a company called Agoda. And you can read all about this in an issue of the Pragmatic Engineer newsletter, fantastic newsletter. And he wrote a little bit about what they've built. And here's a screenshot where you can see you're looking here at an application, right? So I'm looking here at a specific application. I believe this is like the OpenAI proxy that you're looking at. So this is already an app-centric view of the world, right? And I can go in here and I can see this application running in all the different environments. So I'm not looking like at an application or 2 applications, like one app, like my application running in production and my application running in staging, or my application running in the EU and my application running in the US. Those are not 2 different applications. Like as a first-class citizen, we have a screen here, a dashboard that really understands the concept of one application running in prod and running in QA. And I can see the deleted environments as well. And I even have actions. We're going to touch on actions in a second, but I even have actions here, like for new environments or quick deploys, and all that is really important. And again, touching on just what we said about like pulling in the different concerns, here's like leaking out to concerns around console and Vault and SQL, right? So like we're, again, giving an app-centric view of the world where the application is the first-class citizen, and then the application's environments are also a first-class citizen, and we understand that. So this is a really fantastic example of what they built within Agoda that captures the idea of like an application running in different environments and being really multi-environment aware. And like a good way to implement this, it has its flaws, but like a good way to implement this that's really cheap is to like have a drop down in your dashboard where you like toggle between different environments. But again, you do have to generate a dashboard for each application with traditional tooling. Now, I see there's a comment in the chat as well by Shishir, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it says, in my opinion, there's an even better approach to app-centric, which is by providing observability via traversing the dependency graph for infrastructure, platform, service, and service interactions, and providing information at each level that the application developer needs. Thoughts on that? And I would say, hell yes. And like, yes, absolutely. I think that's like really the right approach. What I was hinting at earlier is there's like 2 ways from an engineering perspective you can build this. or rather, there are two parts of how you build this from an engineering perspective. One is like taking an application and like traversing different layers of that on the stack, and then pulling in different concerns. And then like the second part of this is to enable people to customize this and to like do this like really at scale for Java, for Python, for like companies that are running all these different technologies. Then you need a way to be able to like dynamically go and say, like, I know somehow that this is a Java application attached to Java graphs, or I know that this is an application that like uses Redis attached to Q graphs, or I know that this is attached to Redis graphs, or I know that this is an application that like has distributed tracing attached to some other stuff. So what you really want is some way to take like a piece of infrastructure or a pod or an application, right? That's a first-class citizen, look at a label and say, based on that label, like here's the concerns that we want to attach. But you absolutely have to be able to like kind of traverse the dependencies for that application. That's a core part of it as well. So yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so again, 4 pillars. So we cover AppCentric, we cover default by defaults, and we cover multi-environmental wear. And we're going to speak now about giving control and actions. And I just want to point out, though, as we go through this, like each of these things, you kind of can really see in each of them as well. Like even here in Nan's, like this is kind of AppCentric, and obviously it has the graphs, right? Then doesn't do such a good job at the multi-environmental wear. But like each of these is pulling in a few different aspects, right? They're not just one example for one pillar. Okay, but moving on to the final pillar, giving control. And this screenshot isn't as pretty, but it's really, really interesting. And this is a screenshot from Slack. And they wrote a cool blog post about building their internal developer platform and platform thinking, and the type of stuff that really people speak a lot about in this platform engineering community. And like learning what your customers need. And by customers, I mean the developers on your platform. And what Slack did is they built a visual interface that they call GAS with a Z. And it's a visual interface to check your services, see where they're deployed. Again, that's the multi-environment part, view their status, right? And they have a whole bunch of stuff in there. And I just pulled in one screenshot. So like above this, you can see the application, you can see the places where it's running, I think in the pods and other stuff, in some graphs maybe. I forgot the exact details. But I pulled in one part here. They have this really, really cool feature called debug actions. And that's what's right down over here, where it says debug actions at the bottom. And it says, did you know that you can make buttons be here? Find out how. And the idea behind debug actions, they said, is to create a set of commands that are pre-approved to run in your pod and to be triggered from the GAS interface. And this is such a cool feature on so many levels. And the reason it's so important, the reason it's so cool is one, Slack is saying, okay, we're not just going to give you observability into your application on Kubernetes in all the environments and like the current status of that application. We're going to let you do something about it. So you have to go and you have to now take some remediation action. You can go and take that remediation action here from GAS. And some of you are going, wait, what about the safety? What about like, is that secure? We'll touch on that in just a moment. So you can take remediation actions from here. And let's say you have an application that's like a Java application. And for your Java application, you need to sometimes go and like get a memory profile or like do some action to attach the debugger or whatever, right? Like you could put buttons here that do that for your application. This is a really cool thing. And then the other aspects here that like I find really fascinating and really cool is it's this concept of extensibility. Like we're not telling you what you need, we're letting you extend it, right? So we're giving control to you, not just to take actions, we're giving you control to customize this the way you need. And finally, that you can create stuff that's pre-approved. And that's how you address the security concerns. And that's a little bit of how automation plays into this. You can go and define these actions that you need to take on production, but that are safe actions to take, that are sitting somewhere in a Git repository, in a YAML file that have been approved, that give you secure access. And that's really key, because in every enterprise, when it comes to giving control, and when it comes to empowering developers to do observability, and when it comes to empowering developers to own a little bit about operations, the big challenge is, okay, well, we're going to give them access to production, right? Like, how do you do this securely? So you have to do one of two things. Either you have to give them access to production, or you have to not give them access to production, but you have to give them a really good alternative. You can't go and say, okay, you're in charge of observability and troubleshooting issues and remediating problems, but you can't touch anything. Like that's, you're giving them all the ownership without any of the capabilities to do something about it. Now, I think we're going a little bit over on time. So I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Maybe just a question for the team on for the Humanitech team here. How strict do we have to be here on time?
If there's more questions, you're more than welcome to continue answering them.
Okay. Yeah, I have a few more slides as well, but okay, maybe I'll say two more. I'll say just I'll say another 2 or 3 sentences on the remaining slides, and then we'll give everything else over to questions. So I want to just say a word on how this fits into the broader platform engineering initiatives, which is if you think about the path to get to production on Kubernetes, a developer writes an application, he has to containerize it, like write the manifest, you have to package it up with Helm, you have to create environments, you have to do a whole lot of stuff. And then at the end of the day, you have to set whether it's in dashboard and troubleshoot issues and do like cost tuning, right, and right sizing. So like a lot of what we speak about with platform engineering and internal developer platforms is usually on the first half of this. It doesn't touch much on stuff with React. So like how this talk fits into big platform engineering initiatives is I'm saying don't stop your developer enablement efforts over here with create environments, continue your developer enablement all the way into production, what happens after stuff is deployed. And finally, I'm not going to go over it because we're short on time, but I'm just pulling up on screen. Here's the table that I recommend for who owns different things in the organization and when ops and platform or infra or observability teams should take ownership and when developers should have ownership. And what should be in the ownership of developers, what should be in the ownership of ops, and then what's the required, like what do you as a company or a platform team have to do to enable developers to take ownership? And I'm not going to go into this, but this will be in the recording, so anyone can look at it afterwards and ask me questions. Okay, so let's jump over to the questions. So there's a question here in the chat, another question from Shishir, and again, I'm probably butchering your name, so I apologize on that. What is your view on automated remediation workflows when being triggered via simple rule-based system versus new AI apps platform-based remediation workflows being created? It's an interesting question. We do a bit of both. Like when in my professional role and like in my open source role, we're the maintainers of Robusta, which is a rule-based like remediation system or enrichment system for Kubernetes. And then we've been building AI apps capabilities on top of it. So I would say though, as a rule, as a guiding principle, you need to have a human in the loop. Like I would not trust, I don't think we're at the stage yet. We may be there in 5 years from now or 10 years from now. But I think we can use AI apps and AI systems to kind of generate recommendations and to generate even some of those automated workflows. But when we're generating those automated workflows, often that still is using like an underlying rule-based system. I don't think we're at like if you think about how you build like an automated work remediation system with AI apps, right? There's like 2 ways. One way is generative AI, right? You have an AI generate like a bunch of rules for your rule-based system, and maybe it describes it to you in English, and maybe it presents it more nicely, and maybe it summarizes it, but you're still using an underlying rule-based system. And then the human can go and look at those rules and approve it. And then the other way to think about AI apps, which no one is doing today, I don't think we're quite there yet, but I mean, it's interesting, is like an event happens in your production. It doesn't go through a rules-based system. Like in real time, you ask some AI agent, like, oh, here's this event that happened. What should I do about it? And the AI agent decides and then it does something. Like we're not there yet. We're using AI to generate the rules. We're not using the AI at runtime to actually decide. So I hope that helps answer the question. More questions.
I think you've managed to answer all the pressing questions at least. Should we give it a minute for one more if there is any? If not, you do always have the chance to post any questions on the Platform Engineer Slack channel. If there is something afterwards. And I know there's been a few questions, but yes, you will be getting the slides as well as the recording per email afterwards. We've got another question from Alessandro. Would you like to answer?
So Alejandro says, is it Backstage or other tool you recommend to give the app-centric view? I'm biased. I'm building in the space. It's selling commercial platforms for this. So I'm probably Backstage is the most popular option that people are looking at. But then when it comes to observability, I think it's built more around the service catalog-y and like company-related concerns rather than observability. But then like developers are obviously going out there and using using then, so that's like a really good jumping point. And then sometimes people are using Rancher for this too. And then like one way you could do it with the tooling you have today without adopting anything else is you could like build a custom Grafana dashboard per application, or you could do something with like infrastructure as code. And like Grafana has IAC capabilities to try and like automatically generate those dashboards. Then there's like an editing problem if developers want to go and change that, but like maybe you give them defaults. And then I guess one other approach you could take is to like put this in the Helm chart. So I have like a Helm chart that deploys like the infrastructure as code for your like for a Grafana dashboard for each application, and then that developers go and like override things in the Helm chart. But I don't think there are great tooling today that like do the app-centric view with observability. I think that's one of the challenges. There's really good app-centric stuff like Backstage, but it's less focused on observability. So I think that's as good as I could do on a Swiss neutral answer. I hope that helps. But it really doesn't matter the tooling. At the end of the day, like tooling is just tooling, and I think that's a really important thing to remember whenever we build platforms. Like the tooling is the least important thing. All that matters at the end of the day is that your developers are successful and you've been able to empower them. So like you can forget everything I say. Like everything I said today, you can take it and you can throw it in the trash and you can do it completely differently. If your developers are going and responding to stuff and they're not opening Jira tickets and they're not going to the SRE or DevOps team and having them investigate for them, and they're not just like, or ignoring the alerts, which is even worse, like then you're successful and you're doing a great job. So you can ignore everything else I say. So I think the tooling is less important than like the type of thinking that lies behind it. Okay. A comment here that alerts and Robusta is awesome. Thank you very much, Sairadi. And Shisha said, coming to the question of ownership, shouldn't SLO monitoring and alerts on them be co-owned? Yeah, so I said I wouldn't, but I'm going to jump back here just to look at this. I think there is co-ownership on like defining alerts and responding to them. So I would say that like often the developers should not need to know PromQL, for example, if you're using Prometheus. So like the default alerts and maybe even alert templates should be owned like by the apps team or the platform team, but then the developers should own the actual thresholds and the per app customization. So I do think it is a co-ownership model. Thank you very much. And then can you give an example of using AI apps to generate monitoring rules? It's not in it. Okay, so it's not in the observability space. But there are companies that do this for security, for example, where you like can define a security workflow. When something happens, then automatically like go and notify me in Slack or whatever, or pulling this information from this system and then go off to like the some security system and open a ticket or create an incident. So there's a lot of stuff around this in the security space. I don't know if there's a great example that's been released yet in observability, other than what we're all doing, which is like going to ChatGPT and saying, "Can you like write some PromQL for me?" Which everyone is doing. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but I hope that helps a little bit. Finally, And if anyone has questions, please pop them in. If no more questions come in, then this will be the last question. So if you have a question, pop it in now. Shishir asked, should security concerns be owned by specialized SecOps entity or standard DevOps owners? Okay, I'm going to say security. I come from a security background working at a lot of security companies, but it is a joint ownership model. And the thinking behind this is that security is a discipline and security is complex. And like, it's easy to shoot yourself in the foot with security by doing really dumb things that you didn't realize were dumb, and that like it wasn't even fair to expect of you to think they were dumb. And you know, I'll give again the Kubernetes example, but like I'm an application developer and I got something like up and running on Kubernetes and I set up an ingress and like I did all this complicated stuff, but like I accidentally set one field wrong, or like I misunderstood a little bit, and now something's exposed to the internet. Like, it isn't fair. You can't expect that just from me. And then the question is, okay, well, is it the DevOps ownership? Do the DevOps have that expertise? And I would argue that like a simple example like that, like the DevOps can't have enough expertise. When it comes to more complex security concerns, like how you do proper network isolation, or like how you have like a threat model. Let's say one application is vulnerable, it has been exploited, but you want to limit the blast radius on that and like set network policies and prevent it from reaching another application. There's a lot of stuff there that you have to be familiar with that I wouldn't anticipate a typical DevOps team to know. Like, there are all these subtle gotchas. Like, for example, let's say you're running an application, you set network policies, but when you didn't restrict properly the host access, so then you have a pod that can bypass all those network policies by doing something with the host. Okay, and you set all that up, right? Because now DevOps teams know you have to do that. Well, did you set up like proper auditing of the system? Like, there's a lot of stuff that I really wouldn't anticipate a DevOps team to know, just because there's so much to it. So I think security is a discipline, and I would recommend having some dedicated security team, but maybe it's a shared ownership model between like hardcore security, and maybe they do some like red testing, right, as well, and they try and like find the flaws, and then you have a DevOps team that can handle a lot of the typical stuff, and then you have application developers that also have some ownership as well. And you always want to be training the trainers, right? So the security team should be empowering the DevOps team. The DevOps team should be empowering the developers, and so on. Okay, and then I'm just going to take the last question from Friedrich. And do you have a preferred tool for communicating the observability information to customers? Again, I'm biased. We develop an open source solution that takes alerts and forwards them like to the customers. But so by customers here, I mean developers. So I'll answer this. I'm not sure here if customers refers now to developers or refers to your company's customers. So assuming customers here means developers, the customers of your platform team, then we do develop an open source tool called Robusta, where we take Prometheus alerts, we add on information developer need to see, like application logs, and then we forward that to other systems like Slack and like Teams. Okay, so yeah, I see it's for non-dev customers. So I don't have a preferred tool there. I think you want to, whenever you're communicating stuff to customers outside of your organization, then you have to be really careful also to make sure that information doesn't leak out. So I would typically recommend not necessarily taking all the standard stuff and just exposing that, but rather using some like dedicated system for status pages or some alternative flow. Typically that is separate dedicated tooling. And I don't have a specific recommendation here.
I think it's time to wrap it up from here. Thank you so much for answering all the questions. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Yeah, I think we can all joining the Slack channel requires a human ticket. What is our option? Let me get back to you there in a second. You can send me your email directly, so I can add you to that just to ensure we get faster. Yeah, and thank you so much again. I think we'll wrap it up here.
been a pleasure. And I'm on the Slack too. You can join it without Humanitech address. I don't know how, but you can because I did it. And I'm on there, so you can tag me with questions as well. Thank you very much.
Very cool. Okay.